After revolving these things in my mind for many years in intellectual solitude, when at last I was bringing this book to a close, not without profound disappointment that for all my labor it should be no better than it is, I have had the satisfaction of finding that quite independently, in the most various quarters, the same intuition is returning to the world. Not that in my own mind it needed confirmation. These are not eventual matters of fact on which testimony is needed, or witnesses are to be counted like so many head of cattle. But after all, a book is addressed to the public, and the impulse towards expression and communication would remain abortive if no one was ready to listen or to understand. True, my doctrine was neither new nor extinct. Platonism was still remembered round the corner, though strangely out of sight. There was always Catholic philosophy, and far away Indian philosophy loomed impressively in its unraveled labyrinth. But the notion of essence in these systems seemed to be either incomplete or impure, or both impure and incomplete. They were accidental, traditional faiths, borrowing from logic such helps or extensions as they could welcome. They had not that honest personal seat nor that fearless outlook which, amid so many weaknesses, made the strength of modern philosophy. My allegiance is rather to the earlier Greeks, who looked freely and ingenuously on the universe with the curiosity of children, but of children bred nobly and protected from false terrors by a manly civilization. The autonomy of reason, which they so beautifully and simply achieved, is not to be surrendered. In part, indeed, it had been recovered by the modern mind in its romantic Protestantism, but without the Greek clearness and inner freedom. The British and German schools in which it had been my fate to be educated were themselves obscurely rooted in religious confusions. For 300 years they had hardly been able to distinguish the universe or the realm of essence from the vapors of animal feeling. Of late, however, various rifts or transparencies have appeared in the low sky of subjectivism, and curiously, it is the realm of essence that seems to become visible first, the stars, as it were, before the sun. Matter, though so much nearer and dearer to the heart of mankind, is even harder to define and to situate from a psychological point of view. For the more objective a psychological idealist wishes to render his realities, the more empirical and sensualistic they must become. In other words, the more subjective. If an idea develops within its bosom a theory of its own origin or environment, it remains a mere idea, more elaborate than it was, but not more cognizant of anything beyond. Whereas, if it is satisfied to contemplate and to define its internal theme or quality, it thereby begins to dominate a field of logical relations independent of its momentary attention or existence. Thus, intelligence, like the dove after the flood, escapes from the arc of subjectivism more easily through the window than through the door. Three recent descriptions of the realm of essence, one English, one German, and one French, lie at this moment before me. Perhaps a brief report of them may serve to convince the reader that in all this I am not dreaming alone, but that on the contrary I am introducing him to an eternal background of reality which all minds, when they are truly awake, find themselves considering together. In a volume entitled The Concept of Nature by A. N. Whitehead, a systematic distinction is drawn between events on the one hand, which is the name that are given to all self-existing facts or portions of nature, and on the other hand, sense objects and scientific objects, which are the names given to essences, or at least to such essences as the author is concerned with, that he should recognize essences clearly, yet should call them by names so adventitious to their intrinsic nature, is an anomaly easily explained by the circumstances. Whitehead is primarily a mathematician, naturally at home amongst essences, but he is an Englishman and was drawn toward metaphysics at a time and in a circle in which intense local reaction was taking place in British philosophy in favor of realism, but of a realism that should still be empirical and moralistic. It is characteristic of British reformers to disown the distressing consequences of some traditional principle in order to be free to cling to it with a happier mind, and as an Anglican Catholic must denounce the Pope, so an Anglican realist must eschew matter. Here the traditional principle was that of Berkeley, that the only objects of knowledge are inert ideas or the immediate data of experience. And the distressing consequence was that, in that case, nothing latent or dynamic could exist in nature or could be made an object of study. This consequence, at first blush, had seemed to Berkeley a palmary argument for religion, and later it was deliberately made the cornerstone of transcendental idealism. But it was wormwood now in the mouths of the new realists, engrossed as they were in dogmatic judgment, in mathematics, and in cosmological physics. Might not this consequence be denied while maintaining that principle, if we allege that things are in reality compacted of ideas of objects, immediately given in experience, but existing independently of knowledge? All would then be reality and nothing appearance. Yet nothing would exist otherwise than just as it appeared. Events or the substantial facts in nature would be concretions of human sense objects and of human scientific objects. They would no longer be free to embody the confusion of sense and science any essences whatsoever which the Creator might have wished them to possess. How these human objects enter into events and compose them, I will abstain from inquiring. Suffice it that in themselves these objects are evidently essences and not existing elements. Whitehead continually calls them eternal objects, and that is final. Nothing can be more opposite to an event or more remote from natural existence than any eternal being. Yet that the terms, not indeed the intended objects of sense and science, are eternal essences, could not escape so accomplished a mathematician. In his early collaboration with Bertrand Russell, at a time when the latter shared with G.E. Moore a virgin enthusiasm for ideal entities, Whitehead could daily measure the gulf which separates the realm of logic from that of fact. It was a saying of his in those days, for youth sometimes has a shrewdness denied to distracted age, that some truths could be proved but were unimportant, and others were important but could not be proved. Logic evidently was never quite satisfying to this logician, even while feeding on its manna. He yearned for the flesh pots of fact. Tastes are free, but as the whole virtue of flesh pots is to be eaten, so the whole virtue of events is to be enacted. an effort to describe the cuisine of nature exhaustively, were success in it possible, would yield dreadful literature and no food. If, nevertheless, any one had a desire for such, would he be likely to attain it by overlaying the current cookbook of science, which after all has a relative validity, with rich metaphysics of his sheer invention? In a later book on science in the modern world, Whitehead has distinguished essences even more clearly from the occasions on which they may be realized. Each eternal object, he tells us, is an individual which, in its own peculiar fashion, is what it is. Each eternal object is just itself, in whatever mode of realization it is involved. There can be no distortion of the individual essences without thereby producing a different eternal object. Thus, actualization is a selection among possibilities. Each is systematically and by the necessity of its nature related to every other eternal object. The realm of eternal objects is properly described as a realm because each object has its status in this general systematic complex of mutual relatedness. A limited set of such objects is itself an eternal object. It is those eternal objects in that relationship. Thus, the complexity of an eternal object means its analyzability into a relationship of component eternal objects. An eternal object, such as a definite shade of green, which cannot be analyzed into a relationship of components, will be called simple, could hardly be recognized more frankly. It is eternal, compacted of internal relations, indifferently simple or complex, and at every level individual. It composes an infinite pure being. If there are impurities in Whitehead's description, they arise not from his conception of the field of essence itself, where his mathematical expertness gives him an inviolable scope and fertility, but rather from refraction in the thicker atmosphere through which he approaches it. Entirely free from these entanglements, though perhaps caught in others, is the view of essence contained in the pure phenomenology of Edmund Husserl. He is an analytic psychologist of the most conscientious, systematic kind, never forsaking the plane of reflective autobiography, and to boot he is a convinced transcendentalist idealist, always remembering the activity of thought involved in the contemplation or definition of any object, so that his theory is like those early maps of the known world in which the geographer, proud of his young art, placed in the foreground representation of the compass, sextant, and telescope, which had served him in his construction, while in another part, to fill in some large tract of terra incognita, he might show us the gallant ship in which he made his voyages of discovery, or a group of the naked savages found at the antipodes. Such marginal decoration is not without its charm, and the modern reader, accustomed to romanticism even in philosophers, may be more willing to look on essence if he is told at the same time that he is looking at it, how the vision has been achieved. Autobiography may be enlightening even in logic. It reminds us that our map is a map, but it is also grotesque, since it is not the map's business to describe cartography, and thought turns towards essence for the sake of essence, not for the sake of thought. Yet there are advantages in this circumspection or contortion. It is not so easy in learned Germany as in England or America for the gay philosopher to ignore transcendental criticism and psychological fact simply because they were known to some past generation or because they annoy him and he is interested in something else. Husserl accordingly professes to study phenomena which The Platonic tradition identifies with appearances and the positivistic tradition with events, and we might doubt for a moment whether he is considering essences at all and not rather facts or existing objects. But no, all the emphasis falls on the word pure. Objects, in order to enter the realm of this phenomenology, must be thoroughly purified. This purification consists in reducing the object to its intrinsic and evident character, disregarding all question of its existence or non existence, or of its locus in nature, or, in my language, it consists in suspending animal faith and living instead contemplatively in the full intuition of some essence. This essence may be as complex and as rich in inner perspectives as imagination can make it. It may span any depth of spacious time or intuitive duration. Every idea which science or faith may turn into a creed or use in the description of existence is in its spiritual immediacy a pure essence, a term given to contemplation, distinct logically and aesthetically. Otherwise, science and faith would be mere chatter, verbiage accompanying certain terms in action, not inner possessions or forms of thought. Nothing is therefore removed from experience by purifying it, except its distraction. And in essence, far from being an abstraction from a thing, is the whole of that thing as it ever can be directly given or spiritually possessed. In it, instead, says Herschel, of setting up a natural world by a transcendental act of naive assertion, and being driven by the implications of that assertion to posit other transcendent things one after another. We put all these positings aside. We refrain from becoming accomplices in that act, and we direct our discerning, scrutinizing, contemplative glance upon the field of pure intuition in its absolute intrinsic being. We live henceforth in these acts of supervening attention, ranging over the infinite field of absolute immediacy, the bedrock of phenomenology. Geometry and phenomenology, we read in another place, being sciences of pure essence, lay down nothing concerning real existences. Hence, clear fictions will not only serve just as well for these constructions as do actual perception and experience, but often much better. Pure or transcendental phenomenology is not a science of fact, but a science of essences or forms. The phenomena of transcendental phenomenology are, in their nature, non existent. Characteristic als area, all immediate data, amnesia, transcendently purified, are non existent, and are situated out of all local relation and organ to the real world. As the datum of personal experimental perception is a particular thing, so the data of intuition is pure essence. Every science of fact or of experience must needs draw the fundamental terms of its theory from some formal ontology. Immediate vision, not necessarily sensuous observation of things, but awareness yielding any original datum, no matter of what quality, is the ultimate source of validity for all rational assurance. All that I believe to exist in the world of things has, in principle, only a presumptive existence. And finally, in answer to the inevitable reproach, as if it were a reproach, of being a Platonist, the author says, if object meant existing object, and reality meant existing reality, then indeed to call ideas objects and realities would be to indulge in a perverse hypostasis. But when the two are explicitly posed, and when object is defined as any theme of discourse whatsoever, what can be the remaining objection? Between immediacy and existence yawns a veritable abyss in the quality of being, since existence is posited in perspective, never given absolutely as it is, and has an accidental and relative status, whereas being in the immediate is certain and unconditioned, and by its very nature not subject to perspective or given in an external view. Such a firm adherence to transcendental principles serves to bring out the fundamental and ultimate part played by essence in knowledge, and its own immaterial and incorruptible nature. But perhaps this phenomenology is itself only an external view and a perspective, since the fact that experience must play with terms or essences does not imply that all essences must figure in experience. No doubt the field of possible intuition, the range of pure spirit, is infinite, and none other than the realm of essence itself. But is pure spirit itself possible, or does actual intuition realize all essences, or even as many as are realized in the upprobed structure of nature? Naturalists must be allowed to doubt it, and also to look for the genesis and meaning of immediate experience in the material and animal world, where malicious transcendentalism, one that isolates mind and mind, cannot consistently look for them. If a mathematical physicist can vindicate the eternity of essences, and a psychologist their purity, a pupil of the Oriental school may well vindicate their infinity. He will help to dissipate any lingering suspicion that they might be dependent for their being on human intuition or on embodiment in nature. In the books of Rene Guénon, the study of essence in its own absolute sphere is called metaphysics. The proper and even the etymological sense of this word, he tells us, is that by which it designates whatever lies beyond physics, provided we understand by physics, as the ancients always did, the whole of all the sciences of nature. Nothing can be metaphysical except that which is absolutely stable, permanent, independent of all events, and in particular of all historical circumstances. Metaphysics is the consideration of the universal, of the absolutely unlimited, not of matters which special science may leave out because their present development is more or less incomplete, but rather of what, by its very nature, eludes the touch of these sciences. In the domain of metaphysics, no experience, no contact with fact is possible. Being beyond physics, we are also, for that very reason, beyond experience. That is, our thought is not intent on surrounding existences, but on the nature and relations of essences chosen and defined by that thought itself. Hence, in questions of metaphysics, all that can change with times and places is merely the mode of exposition. That which is beyond nature is also beyond change. No discoveries are at all possible in metaphysics. All that is discoverable may have been equally known by certain men in all ages, and such is, in fact, what we may gather from a profound examination of traditional metaphysical doctrines. Metaphysics excludes hypotheses, whence it follows that metaphysical truths cannot be in the least doubtful in themselves. If there is ever occasion for discussion or controversy, it can only be on account of some defect in exposition or in comprehension. Metaphysical truth can be conceived only by a faculty which, because its operation is on the immediate, we may call it intuitive, if it be thoroughly understood that it has absolutely nothing in common with what certain contemporary philosophers call intuition, a merely sensitive and vital faculty properly inferior to discursive intelligence and not superior to it. We speak here of intellectual intuition, which is necessarily infallible, not being actually distinct from its object. Such is the essential basis of metaphysical certitude, whereas reasoning is evidently fallible in consequence of its discursive and mediate character. This use of the term metaphysics would be unobjectionable if it could be adhered to with constancy and by a general agreement, but metaphysics has always been, and is today, an attempt to establish truths about nature and existence, otherwise than by observation, measurement, and experiment. Nor am I sure that the Indians and their French interpreter after them do not attribute to their metaphysics any physical prerogatives, or to their intuition any feminine or Bergsonian privilege of being a miraculous substitute for intellect and a shortcut to knowledge of fact. There is a sense, indeed, in which all existing things depend upon the non-existent realm of pure essence, since they could not be what they are, either intrinsically or in their internal relations to every other nature. Did they not realize and illustrate some part of that primordial structure of being, so that any elucidation of pure essences explores a part of those essences, one or another of which actual things must assume if they are to exist at all, or allow anything to be seen or said of them. But so long as the study of essences is a priori imaginative and metaphysical, there is no likelihood or presumption that those essences will be found realized in anything existent. Before any such assumption can be made legitimate, we must turn with an absolutely docile and clear mind to the empirical aspects and relations of the facts themselves, as exploration and practical mastery unroll them before us. And then, when we have ascertained what essence, in some measure and in some respect, these existing things possess, we may freely develop the dialectical relations of that essence and deepen thereby our intellectual understanding of those things. As, for instance, has been done in mathematics to every one's satisfaction. But if arithmetic and geometry had not been originally the coinage of mechanical art stamped upon the mind by commerce with things, they would have had no application to existence, and no authority over it, as indeed they have not over the whole field of psychic and moral being. Pure metaphysics, then, must call for aid on sense before it can claim to describe existence. It becomes impure and abusive, and such metaphysics as we are all accustomed to when it presumes to describe nature without her consent. And can we doubt that Indian metaphysics does so at least as boldly as the metaphysics of the West? How else comes it infallibly to distinguish 5 physical elements, neither more nor less, or to know that qualities of human sensation, such as sound, are intrinsic to those elements? or to assume that transmigration of souls, or to posit Ishvara and other existing deities between man and the impersonal infinite. Far be it from me to quarrel with the ideology of holy men. My wish is rather to understand and revivify, as far as possible, the essences which any spiritual tradition has made symbols of fate or themes for profound contemplation. My own native themes and symbols are probably not better, only I would not let the lust of imposture in others or in myself distort that meditation. Illusion is the greatest enemy to peace. However perfect such however perfect such intellectual peace may ultimately become, how remote from all bias or presumption appears in the direction of all Indian discipline upon deliverance from existence. Of course, this deliverance can be imaginative only, else peace would never be realized. But to exist as if not existing is a blessed deliverance, not only from the troubles of the flesh, but from the illusions of philosophy. It is the enlightenment which the philosopher seeks. Existence produces a false isolation and a vain reinforcement of some fragment of essence, which by the logical necessity of its being forms part of an infinite and eternal realm. We therefore escape and overcome existence automatically in the act of understanding what existence is. That it is a blindness to almost everything, although this blindness comes of being dazzled by a few features which matter, the principle of existence, happens to embody and to press upon the attention of the organisms which it forms. The universe, then, is but a stain in the purity of the infinite, of that non-existence by accident, which is pure being by necessity. Such bandying about of dark phrases need not irritate a tolerant mind that knows the various realms of being and their disparate sorts of reality. Thus, Gunan himself uses the word being not indeed for existence, but for only so much of essence as is illustrated there, precisely for that segment of essence which I call the realm of truth. If ontology of the science of being, he writes, is subordinate to metaphysics and belongs to it, it is far from identical with metaphysics as a whole, because being does not signify the non-manifested absolutely, but only the principle of the manifested part. That is, being is so much of the eternal script as the regent is destined to render visible at one time or another. Consequently, that which lies beyond being is of much more importance, metaphysically, than is being. In other words, it is Brahma, not Ishvara, that must be acknowledged to be the supreme principle. According to this use of language, metaphysics would mean the description of the realm of essence, ontology that of truth, and physics or natural philosophy that of existence. Existence having an urgent sort of reality, but a derivative and a lame sort. Being, while it is properly the principle of universal manifestation, the essence, which is temporally embodied in the universe, lies outside and beyond this manifestation of it. And here we may call to mind the unmoved mover of Aristotle. The existing world, as well as eternal essence, is no doubt real, but only in a relative fashion. By virtue, by virtue of its subordination to its principle, and insofar as something of this principle is reflected in it, as an image reflected in a mirror draws all its reality from the object, without which it would have no existence. It would have no existence. But this subordinate reality, which is only borrowed, is illusory in comparison with the supreme reality. That is, with the eternal essence there momentarily exemplified, even as the image in the mirror is illusory in comparison with the object. And if we attempted to cut the image off from its original, the illusion would vanish into non-entity, pure and simple. But then, besides being unsubstantial and impermanent, it would not even deceptively manifest any essence. From this, we may understand that existence, or conditioned and exemplified being, is at once real in one sense, and illusory in another, a point which people in the West have never rightly understood. In invoking the authority of the Indians and of their lucid French interpreter, I wish I might invoke it without reserve. But there is a mass of cosmological and historical extravagance entangled with their metaphysics, which is nothing to my purpose. Tradition is venerable where it transmits a unanimous spiritual discipline by which the souls of essential hermits in every age and country have been made sensitive to the contingency of fact and the eternity and infinity of pure being. But superstitions too are traditional, and not for that reason respectable. Superstition prevails also in traditional philosophy in the West, not only in theology, but in biology and psychology. It is maintained there by an ancient and stubborn confusion of formal with efficient causes, the forms which things wear, since these things could not be themselves without those forms, are said to make the things what they are, and so the essence by which a thing is classified and named is introduced among the efficient conditions which have ushered it into existence and endowed it with that particular form. Conditions which are all ultimately material. Matter is requisite for continuity and change, or for brotherly existence. This is often implied and sometimes confessed by the most sweeping idealisms. Thus, Guénon himself writes, individual modifications, such, for instance, as pleasure and pain, all proceed from the plastic principle, prakriti or prana, as from their only root. It is in this substance, containing potentially all the possibilities of manifestation, that the modifications are produced in the phenomenal order by the mere unfolding of these possibilities, or to use Aristotelian terms, by their passage from potentiality into act. Every modification, parinama, says Vijnana Bhikshu, from the original formation of the world, that is, of each cycle of existence, until its final dissolution, comes exclusively out of Prakriti and its derivatives. Whence, indeed, should change come except from a region of changes? Where else should existence be enacted, save in a medium where forms may arise and lapse, may be irrationally conjoined, and may quarrel for their essence, or appear spirit eternally contemplating that realm, and may quarrel for their substance, and transmit it to one another. The realm of essence, or a pure spirit eternally contemplating that realm, since it is immutable and incapable of any local emphasis or arbitrary exclusion, can have no influence whatsoever on the production of anything. Nevertheless, bewildering equivocations continue to play about the word make. What makes this table a table? Surely we may innocently answer, its form and its uses. Therefore, in contempt of the wood and the carpenter, the metaphysician may proceed to assure us that the essence of tabularity, or the essence of utility, is the true and only creator of this table. An air of profundity may be given to this nonsense by the fact that the genesis of things in nature is mysterious and untraceable by human fancy, while we reconcile ourselves habitually to our own being and action merely by naming and expecting them. As within us, so without us, the flux of matter amid a welter of waste and chaos is rich in transitory harmonies, and this world is truly miraculous in the sense in which any existing world was bound to be so. The verbiage of metaphysics might therefore pass as decent drapery for our ignorance or eloquent expression of it. But the trouble is that when some good critic detects that innocent imposture, he may extend his scorn to the realm of essence in its legitimate prerogative. These do not include any power of piecing out the imperfections of physics, the forms of things conceived to exist before the things, and to call them into existence would indeed be Camari Abominante in vacuo. Nevertheless, the forms which things assume when they assume or suggest them are clearer, more interesting, and more beautiful than their substance or their causes. It would be a pity if the abuse of logic hardened men's hearts against poetry and made them enemies to their own intellectual life. The metaphysicians, in their impatience of pure essences, which are their appointed food, are to blame for this misunderstanding. They insist that their clairvoyance is historical or physical knowledge, but this pretension is not only easily disproved, but is unworthy of their contemplative vocation. This expressly carries their thoughts beyond the accidents of life and lifts them into communication with another realm of being, more akin to the spirit, since there an infinite variety of boundless freedom coincides with peace, and possession with security.